Hi, welcome back. This is the second presentation, second PowerPoint, narrated PowerPoint on CC14, the international economy. And it's looking at, we're moving on to look at issues of globalisation, both in terms of some of the good things and the bad things, and also giving you a couple of examples to consider, one being China, which is the one that you were looking at previously, and to the UK and the effect that globalisation has had on the UK. So there are some links for you to go and take a look at, some questions to ask or answer based on some of the content that's already been discussed in the previous pages of the booklet. And the other thing I want you to give some time to do is to take a look at the various different links that I've sent through to you, because that does give some wider context for some of the issues. Okay, so first things first then, something about the value chain and the 3 stages of the value chain. There's a link on to Mind Tools, which actually explains the principle of the value chain and value analysis, which is something that Michael Porter came up with as a concept. And then also other areas that I'd like to give some consideration to, the way that Glaxo has actually moved its business up the value chain and concentrating much more on innovation and strategic positioning rather than just producing chemicals, etc. So that gives you some ammo to go away and take a look at and see how a more advanced economy is attempting to sort of address some of the principles and issues of globalization, and in this instance obviously moving more towards a knowledge-based economy, rather than just even service-based. So that gives you some a little bit of research to do, and that hopefully will create some clarity in terms of how the UK, a more advanced country, might be dealing with the issues of globalization. Okay, so let's move on from there and start taking a look at some of the issues with globalization then. So the first one obviously is pollution, and again using China as an example. Watch the clip that's included there, which gives an idea of just how pollution from China's growth has taken a toll on the health of a number of its residents. And again, take some notes based on the excuse me, on the link there. If you do want to see the links live and rather than having to type them in yourself, I've provided the actual presentation, the narrated presentation we're talking about now, which is on the File tab on Teams, under Class Materials, under CC14 Globalization, and then you should be able to go to the first presentation, PowerPoint 1, I think it's called PowerPoint 1 on globalization, and that should allow you to open up the PowerPoint, and provided you're watching it in slide view, you can actually then click the links and go straight to them, which might save you a bit of time. Okay, so again, the nature of this booklet is very much that there's content within the booklet, but there are also some links which hopefully are going to give you some context that you can actually discuss in any sort of answers that you might need to come up with as far as globalization and some of the issues that we might face, and making sure that's bringing some relevance to your answers. So the first one is pollution. Second one is increased inequality within countries. And there is an example, again, using China as the example, trying to explain why the inequality is increasing within China, although, as we've heard on numerous occasions, there are so fewer people now that are in absolute poverty, partly due to the industrialization and globalization. However, there is still significant inequality. And on page 11 in your booklets, not only have you got the chart that we got here, which obviously tells a story, there is also some text which actually supports that too. And so I pose a question really: why do you think that inequality is increasing within China? And hopefully this gives some sort of an indication. We can see that from 1990 through to 2013, there is a significant difference between rural per capita net income and urban per capita disposable income. So where individuals have actually moved from the rural economy more into the more urban areas, and obviously the manufacturing and industrial explosion that's happened within China over the last 15 to 20 years. That clearly has had a significant impact. However, again, scratching below the surface a wee bit, there is still a significant large number of the population who are living in rural deprivation and working off the land, living off the land through agriculture, and they clearly are still significantly poorer than other parts of the country. Okay, so as I said, on page 11 there's some text which actually hopefully will help you to consider exactly what's going on there. And obviously, this rural population is a significant number of people within China that are still living in relatively deprived conditions. Let's take a look at the next one, then, exploitation of workers. So in this instance, the country example is Bangladesh, and I'm sure you maybe remember this back in I think it was about 10 years or so ago, 2013. One of the largest garment industries in the world, Bangladesh. Over 1,000 workers were killed when there was a factory collapse, and that was probably down to the fact that workers were being asked to work in unsatisfactory conditions. Maybe the health and safety conditions in Bangladesh at the time weren't maybe up to where they should have been. So again, another example of transnational companies being accused of a number of things: exploiting workers in developing countries by paying low wages and getting them to work long hours. Obviously, the TNCs and the MNCs might argue that they're bringing higher wages to the country, but the argument is that in terms of the amount of work that is expected, the number of hours, and the relatively low wages they're paying in comparison to maybe other workers that they have in other parts of the world, that clearly is somewhat of an issue. And much as we can understand the reasons why TNCs may choose to go to countries where you have low labour costs, there's no excuse for exploitation of workers in that scenario, because obviously that's just not an acceptable thing. In some cases, they might be employing child labour. They clearly tend to, not tend to set up where there are lax health and safety standards, but by the nature of a country being a less developed country, they're probably not going to have the same sort of health and safety standards as a more developed country. And the TNCs will be aware of this and actually might bend the rules to suit themselves, perhaps. As we mentioned, one of the biggest garment industries in the world in Bangladesh, but that clearly was a terrible disaster and human tragedy, and clearly one that hopefully is not going to be repeated in the near future. So the clip, which tells you a little bit more about that and about the issues of exploitation of workers, again, take a look at that, which will just help you to add some more notes to the argument, if you like. Other examples of exploitation of workers. Okay, so this is in Qatar, and some of you may be familiar again that where the Qataris are investing humongous amounts of money in development and building of stadia for the World Cup and various other things that they're attempting to show the world how advanced they are. Some of the issues and some of the working conditions that are facing some of the immigrants from the Indian subcontinent are truly, truly awful. And again, there is a link there for you to take a look at that and add to your notes. Next one then, talking about some of the issues. So we talked about exploitation of workers, but sometimes we maybe need to look at evaluating this, and there is a view from certain economists that actually sweatshops, whilst they might be abhorrent to us in the more well-developed countries, well, there is an argument to say that that sweatshops may actually be helping the poor. And again, there's a link for you to take a look at. It's about a 5-minute video, I think, which actually lists some of the reasons why certain economists believe that that sweatshops may actually be helping the poor rather than exploiting them. So again, if we were going to answer a question on this whole area of exploitation, being able to evaluate that and maybe give both sides a balanced view would definitely be a useful thing to consider. Okay, next thing then. So we talked about 3 things so far. 1 was pollution, 2 was increased inequality, and 3 was exploitation of workers. We're now going to move on and take a look at tax avoidance by transnational and multinational companies. And now, the classic example, and some of you may be familiar, I think we might even talked about it previously, is of Ireland, where they have a particularly favourable tax regime for and have used that effectively to target lots of big transnational corporations who are looking to avoid tax where they can. Okay, so tax avoidance is not necessarily that's legal. Tax evasion is illegal, but one could argue that avoiding tax is morally not necessarily the right way to go, particularly when these large organisations are making lots of money from certain parts of the world and maybe not paying the tax that they should be paying to keep the infrastructure of that particular part of the world where it should be. And the argument is that maybe they're not doing what they should be doing to be good citizens. Okay, so on page 13 in your booklets, there is an article on transnational companies and the tax avoidance, and it talks specifically about the loopholes that are in the Irish tax system. And clearly large multinational businesses, like some of the logos that you can see just over, move myself over there a minute, they have huge amounts of staff, very, very clever staff, members and accountants and lawyers and solicitors who are looking at ways in which they can actually be the most cost effective and cost efficient. So when there are tax loopholes, then clearly in some instances that means that they can minimise the amount of tax they pay outside of their home country, their headquartered country. So there is a number of articles, and certainly one of the things that's mentioned on a couple of occasions is Apple setting up in Ireland, and the fact that they avoided something to the tune of about 14 billion euros of tax by funneling profits through their Irish subsidiary, and it was very, very cleverly thought through. But one would have thought, given how right on Apple are in terms of their human rights, etc., that they wouldn't necessarily be doing those sorts of things. However, I'll leave you to take a look at that and go into that in a bit more detail if that's something that interests you. So tax avoidance, clearly a big issue. So let's take a look then at this principle then of deglobalization. So we talked about globalization, we talked about all the advantages, we've mentioned some of the disadvantages, but also there is a view that in some cases deglobalization may be something that's on the rise. And there are 2 articles on page 13, one which links to this globalization to localization clip, and also an economist article that has the steam gone out of globalization, which effectively is giving the other side to globalization. And again, if we were going to do an essay on globalization and the benefits, then maybe we should also be thinking about deglobalization and the reason why that has become a bit of a phenomenon. And that is actually included in quite a long article on page 13, so down at the bottom, and then on to page 14. and that gives a very good summary as to why, in some cases, globalization might have been, seen as the great white hope, so to speak, in terms of improving matters across the world. However, as we've said before, there is always two sides to the story, isn't there? So when we think about the financial crisis and some of the interdependent issues, that interconnected nature of the society in which we live, maybe there is an argument to say that that's not so much of a good thing. Okay, and clearly when we're put in a position where maybe our economy is being threatened by globalization to some degree, maybe we're not doing as much international trade as we would like. Maybe there is a view that increasing tariffs and looking at quotas, etc., may be another option. And so there are a number of phenomena that have been talked about. We've talked about localization, but also there's a principle known as globalization, okay, which basically is explained in the article on page 14, and hopefully that gives you another view as to whether there are issues around the whole argument and ever-increasing speed at which globalization seems to be changing the way in which we do business across the world. So there's a link there that you can go and take a look at too, okay, which explains a wee bit more about this principle and talks about the recent trends in globalization. And you can also see from the stats being shown here that we've got goods traded, the annual percentage change, and then the real GDP growth and the annual percentage change. So you can see that in certain times, clearly, when we hit the global financial crisis around about 2009, we had a significant issue around two things. One, both trading goods and also real GDP. In this case, the growth rate falling significantly into negative figures. Okay, so as I mentioned, the question or the article is followed by 5 questions, and with the questions should come from either you viewing the answers, not the questions are coming from me. The answers come from the article on page 13, 14 in CC14, but also based on some of the clips that you would have seen over the last couple of slides that we've talked about. Okay, so 5 questions to answer, and then also thinking about how you might answer those questions, and then moving on to page 15 in your booklet. There is a structure, an essay-based structure for you to consider when you're trying to give an idea of what the impacts of globalization and global companies have on individual countries, governments, producers and consumers, workers and the environment, and looking at advantages for each and disadvantages, any limitations, what sort of possible solutions there may be to the issues, and also doing the whole depends on, to try and give a balanced view. Okay, so it's all well and good saying globalization is great, but I think particularly if we're talking about a 25-mark question, then you're going to need to be thinking about giving the alternative view as well. So all the benefits and all the factors, all the positive factors for globalization, but also some of the issues around some of the negatives, and then obviously giving a balanced view, and then coming up with a judgment to say whether you believe globalization is a good thing or a bad thing. And like we said before, dependent on the evidence that you bring to bear to demonstrate that, and if you're choosing to either go globalization is a good thing or globalization is a bad thing, then obviously make sure that the evidence that you are using is more powerful for whichever view or judgment that you're going to come up with. Okay. Okie dokie. So let's just move myself away from there a minute so you can see what's going on there. So again, this is just a summary of the table that is included on across page 15 and 16 in your booklets. And again, use that almost as a writing frame, if you like, to take some of the information that we've had included in the last few pages of the booklet, and also some of the links that I've explained to you. Okie dokie. So let's take a look at the next thing within CC14, which is foreign direct investment. Now, we've already talked about FDI and the fact that it is very closely linked to globalization, and part of the reason for foreign direct investment is to gain from the advantages of globalization specifically. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail then. So FDI, FDI, the three letters standing for foreign direct investment. Okay, so what does that all mean then? Okay, so clearly, if we're talking about multinational companies, the development of them has resulted in a huge amount of foreign direct investment in the global economy. And this is a long-term investment provided by private multinationals or transnational companies in countries overseas, and this FDI normally happens in one of two ways. One, either the multinational or transnational builds new plants, or expands their existing facilities in foreign countries, or alternatively, they may merge or acquire existing firms in foreign countries. So, for instance, Qatar bought Harrods as a classic example. Okay, so thinking about what makes a country attractive for FDI then. Obviously, one of the things is it gives access to a large and profitable market. The multinational companies will probably get some sort of incentives to come and set up in those countries, but also, as far as they're concerned, if they have spotted that there is a large and profitable market for their products and services, then clearly setting up in a country where you're close by your market, then clearly that's a good thing. There are some serious cost advantages to that, and also understanding some of the local issues that that you may face when trying to sell your product to a local market. Obviously, one of the big advantages is the skilled labour and the relatively cheap labour that's available in certain parts of the world. And again, multinational companies will be doing some fairly serious thinking about where they're going to set up. And one of the factors will be, is there a skilled labour force, and what sort of labour price are we talking about? And clearly, in most cases, most less well-developed countries will have cheaper labour than those that are more well-developed. Another option might be access to primary resources, could be mining or farming. And again, by setting up in a country that's rich in certain resources, that might actually be a good reason why they might set up in that particular area. So if we're going to explain inward and outward investment then, and this is something that we could be asked to do, basic difference is inward investment is when an economy receives an inflow of investment from a firm. And obviously outward investment is when a firm sends an outflow of investment to another economy. So dependent on where that firm is headquartered, you could argue that if they're deciding to say, let's say a US company is deciding that they're going to invest in another part of the world, then clearly that would be an outflow from the US into another economy. So that's quite an important principle to remember. Okay, now the other thing to bear in mind is that essentially FDI is essentially a form of offshoring. So when we talked about the difference between outsourcing and offshoring, offshoring is basically where a country is actually investing directly into another part of the world, setting up a new factory, or buying or expanding their existing facilities, and or acquiring existing firms. Whereas outsourcing is where organisations will do that, multinational companies will do that, but that's where they're actually buying services, components, or finished products from independent suppliers rather than having to do it themselves. Okay, so it gives them extra capacity, but it's not necessarily that would be them effectively investing in other parts of the world in terms of of buying services from other countries' firms and businesses, but it's not actually setting up directly in that country. Okay, if we talk about the reasons for FDI, then there's 3 reasons. I want you to have a think about what these reasons are. Okay, now I've listed them, but I want you also to try and fill in this table on page 17. Okay, so 3 reasons of FDI: market seeking, resource seeking, or efficiency seeking. So see if you can come up with some reasons why FDI may be a good thing, and then obviously we can take a look at that together. So I'll give you a bit of time just to have a go at that, and then we'll come back and discuss what the answers were. Okay, so let's, if you want to stop the presentation here and give that a go, and then we'll come back and talk about it in a little bit more detail. Okay, so welcome back. So let's look at market seeking then. So here's an example. If I can get this thing to work. Okay, so if you're seeking a new market, that clearly is going to be a fairly important reason why you might choose to directly invest in a foreign country. So an example there then to give you. So a firm wants to access a growing or profitable market. So Nissan produces cars in Sunderland and have been doing for a number of years, but they invested a humongous amount of money in setting up pretty much a state-of-the-art plant in Sunderland. And part of the reasons why they did that in Sunderland in the UK was so that they could access and sell to the European Union and the when we were still within it. So there was a huge reason for that, which was number one for them to be close by to in order to reduce costs, but also to be able to access, because they were based in an EU country, they were able to access the EU market as well. Resource seeking would be another one then. So a firm might want to access factors of production. So Chinese firms in the last few years have invested very, very heavily in sub-Saharan Africa in order to secure supplies of raw materials. Okay, so there might be those countries may be primary product dependent, and clearly China, with their huge appetite for developing manufacturing capabilities and power stations and all the growth and infrastructure improvements, have needed to and have chosen to secure regular supplies, consistent supplies of raw materials, based on the fact that they've then set up in those countries. Another one could be efficiency seeking. Okay, so this is probably the one that most multinational companies would claim, and that's about reducing and trying to reduce their unit costs of production. Okay, so set up in places where labour costs are lower, and then they can benefit from the economies of agglomeration. And I've given, in case you weren't sure what agglomeration is, I've also included what that is. So it's essentially where you tend to find in urban economics, what happens is that firms that are in the same area, or that are maybe tech suppliers to large organisations, tend to set up near one another. Okay, and that clearly you could argue adds other economies of scale. So if a large organisation or a large MNC decides to set up in a particular place, they might be thinking, well, we know that there's already some infrastructure in place. There's already high levels of technical support, or whatever the support they may be requiring from, and then as a result of that, they would tend to find, and you do tend to find this in all parts of the world actually, that when there becomes like a hub. So for instance, and taking Bournemouth as an example, I know that might seem a little bit parochial, but that's become a real digital hub because of the university and the fact that there's so many enterprising students that are coming out with high-level digital skills. So that's become the digital hub outside of London in the UK. Now, in the same way, in other parts of the world, there are other places where you tend to find that the same types of organisation set up very close to one another, and that's partly to do with economies of scales and some of the benefits that brings. Okay, so let's take a look then at changing FDI flows then. So there is an article here that you can go and take a look at, and there is also a live chart which actually gives you an idea of how things have changed over the last few years. And clearly, FDI flows will change, as you'd expect. On page 17, under that table that you just completed, there are some questions to answer based on the clip from The Economist. And also, if you flick over onto page 18 in your booklet, there is also an article which tells you a little bit more about UK investment or FDI in the developed world, because clearly foreign direct investment happens in the developed world too. It's not just in the developing world. So that gives a slightly different view and a balanced argument for FDI, both in the developed and the developing world. Okay. So there are 6 questions there for you to have a go answering, which are included in your booklet on page 17, and we can then move forward and take a look at the last part of this presentation, which looks at the FDI in the developed world, and the UK article that I've just mentioned, which is on page 17. Okay. So if we then take a look at the way in which, again, we might try to argue, if we were asked to put an argument together for this type of approach. So there we have, again, almost a writing frame for you to consider. And in this instance, we're looking at the following effects of inward FDI on the UK economy as positive or negative. Okay, so in this instance, to give some ideas, we've got an effect. We've got whether it's positive or negative, and then also try to explain in a little bit of detail why you think, what's supporting your judgment as to whether it's positive or negative. Okay, I'm going to move myself again in order to show you what's going on here. Okay, so a firm may export to Europe and other countries. So let's take a look at this as an example. Would that be a positive or a negative? A firm exporting to Europe and other countries as far as inward FDI into the economy. Would that be positive or negative? Well, it's clearly going to be positive in this instance. Increasing the UK capital stock, again, in terms of capital stock, that's the amount of money that's available for investment, and clearly if that increases, then that's likely to mean, there's more money available, then that clearly is going to be an encouragement for further FDI. Businesses sending profits out of the UK, clearly not a good thing. That's going to be a negative thing for FDI. Increasing tax revenue to UK government, that clearly would be an effect of inward FDI to the economy, and whether that's positive or not, well, it clearly would be positive. What about the last one then? UK producers may have access to the latest technology from abroad. That clearly would be a positive, wouldn't it? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the explanations for that then. Okay, so the first point where we're talking about a firm may export to Europe and other countries. Well, clearly, if they've chosen to inward FDI, and so that essentially has been on the UK economy, then exports are basically an injection into the circular flow of income and improve the balance of payment current account for the UK. If we take a look at the UK capital stock, well, that's going to increase the production possibility frontiers for the UK, isn't it? Because effectively that's going to mean that we can overall produce more. This negative, where businesses are sending out, if the repatriation of profits is an outflow from our balance of payment current account, so clearly that would be a negative as far as FDI is concerned. However, the argument is that the new firms will pay corporation tax, assuming that they don't engage in large-scale tax avoidance. So again, dependent on the organisation and what their views are and whether they're sustainable and want to sort of support the countries that they're setting up in, that's again a bit of a moot point really. And then finally, obviously the technology transfer is clearly going to be a good thing, because that's going to improve UK productivity, which does tend to lag somewhat behind other advanced economies. So that hopefully gives you an idea of how you might go about that whole process. And again, thinking about the positives, but also then supporting that with with some explanation as to why. Okie dokie, let's have a look at this last couple of pages then, where we're looking at the economic benefits of FDI. And then I think we'll stop because I think I've been rattling on for a little while now. So there we go then. So there's a chart there that I want you to take a look at. FDI inflows, global and by groups of economies, 1995 to 2013, and projections from 2014 to 16. So the projection is basically a forecast. It's not actual, it's a forecast, and that's something to bear in mind whenever you're shown a chart of this nature, to break some of those things down. Okay, and then also take a look at what the world totals are, where those FDI inflows have been going to. Clearly not all developed economies, some developing, some developed, and some in transition. So so you can see in this instance the developed economies are in fact 52% of all, well, based on the projection, 52% of all FDI is into developed economies, and more often than not, we tend to think that FDI tends to focus on developing economies. It's clearly still a significant amount, but that has changed significantly over time. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the economic benefits then. And again, this is what we're trying to do here, is give some ideas of how you might be able to structure your thought process. And if you like, it's almost a slightly different form of essay structure that you could apply. And in this instance, we're talking about some of the economic benefits of FDI. So clearly, that's going to add to economic growth, employment, and inflation to some degree. Okay, so clearly, in terms of inward investment, we need to think about how that might affect aggregate demand. Also, how it might affect aggregate supply. So there are two things immediately that one could actually try to structure an argument around. And then we could use the ASAD model to show how inward investment from a multinational company can affect a recipient's country's growth, employment, and inflation in the short and the long run. And clearly, that would then create a good talking point that you could narrate within your answer. Obviously, in this instance, investment, any form of investment, is an injection into the circular flow, and clearly, we could also talk about that kicking off a multiplier effect, and you could explain how that works. Okay, so effectively in this instance, if we're talking about some of the economic benefits, then clearly we could talk about how much of a difference that's going to make is going to really depend on the size of the multiplier, and that obviously has some impacts too. We could also talk about elasticity of the aggregate supply, the size of any output gap that we might have, the size of investment when you evaluate the impact of that investment. So again, what we tried to do here, and what we're trying to do in the last few booklets, is to try to give you some different ways in which you can approach structuring your answers and then evaluating those as you go to. And another example of an extra piece of evaluation, so going very heavy on the evaluation. Now clearly, if you're talking about a 25-mark question, then that is where you're going to get great value from evaluation. Okay, so other things that we could talk about, there could be some possible conflicts between foreign investment-led growth and environmental sustainability, because maybe those foreign investors may be not quite as environmentally aware as you maybe would want them to be, or maybe they might be using the fact that where they're investing is not quite so health and safety conscious, and that obviously then creates other issues around FDI. Okay, other things that we can talk about then. Okay, so that was just economic benefits, so economic growth, employment, and inflation. The second one we could take a look at is jobs. So why might investment by an MNC not increase local employment? That would be one thing that we could take a look at. Another things that we might bear in mind, that MNCs might exploit local workers, and what are the issues around that. The next thing we could take a look at is tax revenue. Now, clearly, FDI by an MNC should result in greater tax revenue for the recipient country. And if that happens, then clearly there's going to be a benefit to that country's economy. However, there are several examples, and we talked about a few of them already, of multinational companies that maybe have avoided tax. So much as it would appear on the face of it that FDI by an MNC should lead to greater tax revenue, in some cases that may be if they're avoiding tax or they've got their lawyers all over it and trying to make sure that they pay as little tax as possible, that may be not quite such a great economic benefit of FDI. Clearly, an improvement in the current account on the balance of payments should actually benefit. Where on the balance of payments will initial FDI by the MNC appear? That's something to bear in mind. And once the MNC is established, where on the balance of payments do the profits made by the MNC appear? Okay, provided that they have declared those. So again, some interesting views as to how you might go about this whole process in terms of your argument and structuring your view on a hot issue like foreign direct investment, which links to globalization and also to multinational companies very much so. Okay, so on the page 21 in your booklets, there is an article on FDI. More than a third of foreign investment in multinationals is multinationals dodging tax. Now, clearly, that's a fairly controversial statement, but it clearly has some support. And the article covering page 21 and moving over onto page 22 is something that I'd like you to take a look at and have a go at answering. Okay, so so that article is highlighting some of the issues around that and also some of the potential ways in which that might be addressed. So that's something that you can take a look at for me. Okay, so why does it matter that nearly 40% of FDI creates no real business activities? Here, these are sort of questions that I'm not necessarily saying that you're going to get asked those, but it is something to bear in mind. And taking a look at the question or the content that's included in that article, that should help you to be able to answer this particular question that's been posed. Which countries have most phantom FDI, and why might firms be moving money to them? The next one, explain the Apple operations in Ireland. Well, that's a proper can of worms if you care to open it, and there are lots of articles on the web that explain some of the issues that were being faced. And finally, why is it so hard for governments to clamp down on phantom FDI? So I'm going to stop it there. I think that's about 3/4 of an hour or so. So that gives you a summary on benefits and also some of the negatives of globalization. It talks a little bit more about FDI and some of the issues around FDI too. And so we will stop there, and the next time we move on, we'll start to look at the consequences of globalization for less developed and for more developed countries too. Okay.